All right, thank you. Yeah, it's kind of a tough act to follow Chris and Joe, and then talk about government regulations. I mean, and plus you've all had something to eat, so you're pretty sleepy, as I am. So I'll try and make this quick and hopefully informative. I think before I get too started on this, I'd like to recognize one more time Bob Brown as president of the AMA, and I will tell you, he's been a real driving force within the leadership of AMA and bringing FPV and drone racing to the forefront. And it really is an exciting new discipline within our hobby. And although we get wrapped up in a lot of other issues, one of the things I like to see and one of the things that really encourages me is most of the people in this room are younger than I am. And I was relating, if we were talking about free flight models today, I'd be the youngest one in the room. So I think that really that tells you where the next generation is going with this hobby and the follow-on for model aviation. But the issue of regulation has really been at the forefront since 2007, 2008, when the FAA started getting serious about writing new regulation for unmanned aircraft. And when they first started talking to AMA about their approach to the hobby side of that equation, was that what they wanted to do was to regulate model aircraft by exempting them from regulation and putting to a community-based set of guidelines. So the idea of CBO and community-based management of the sport isn't anything new. I mean, AMA has been doing it since 1936 and has been doing it successfully and safely for decades. But that was actually the FAA's approach, and we were invited to sit on the first aviation rulemaking committee back in 2008, and the recommendations that went up to the FAA in April of 2009 was just that there would be a two-path approach to recreational UAS or model aircraft. One path would be a regulatory approach that would dovetail in with the business and commercial aspect of UAS, and the other path would be a community-based approach organized and managed by an organization like AMA. FAA started writing their new rules in April of 2009. It took until February of 2015 to actually put them out in the form of a notice of proposed rulemaking. But during that time, the concept and approach to UAS really took a lot of turns and a lot of paths. In 2012, Congress actually stepped in and set the tone for how recreational UAS would be managed through what's called the Special Rule for Model Aircraft. It was part of the FAA Modernization Reform Act of 2012, or what was the next reauthorization bill for FAA. And again, in that legislation, they said that model aircraft can operate under a community-based set of safety guidelines as long as you follow some simple rules. And they talked about not interfering with manned aircraft, notifying airports when you're operating within 5 miles of an airport, remaining within visual line of sight of the operator. And that pretty much has what we've been operating on ever since it was enacted in February of 2012. However, in 2011, and more importantly, in 2013, there was a case that came along called the Perker case, in which the FAA fined an individual for what they viewed as careless and reckless operation for flying through the campus area of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. That case went to the National Transportation and Safety Board, and the original law attorney, or the original judge on that case, said that the model aircraft that individual was flying does not meet the requirement for FAA regulation. FAA appealed that to the full board, and that ultimately got reversed in November of 2014. But between the administrative law judge's ruling and the ultimate reversal in 2014, the FAA published what it called its interpretive rule, or interpretation of that special rule for model aircraft that Congress passed, talking about operating under a community-based organization. And long story short, getting around to what affects you guys, is that's where this idea that FPV goggles was not allowed under the special rule for model aircraft. In the interpretive rule that was published, FAA said that Congress's requirement for the pilot to have visual contact with his aircraft precludes the operation of goggles because you can't see the aircraft physically if you're looking at the cockpit view through the goggles. Now, AMA has a safety guideline that allows the requirement for visual line of sight to be accomplished by the use of a spotter or an observer. And that spotter is tasked with maintaining situational awareness, he's tasked with maintaining visual contact with the aircraft, and more importantly, he's tasked with monitoring the airspace and providing see and avoid guidance to the pilot for any manned aircraft that might come into the vicinity. FAA's position on that was that the law doesn't allow for a spotter, that it has to be the pilot himself or herself that's actually looking at the aircraft. In August of 2014, we took exception to that and several other parts of the interpretive rule, and we filed a petition with the U.S. Court of Appeals asking the court to do a judiciary review of the interpretive rule on those areas that we were in disagreement on, one being FPV, along with several others. That fall, the court took the case, but they put the case on abeyance because as part of the interpretive rule, it went out for public comment. And there was an absolute record-setting 33,000 plus public comments submitted to the FAA based on its interpretive rule. And the court told the FAA to go through all of those comments and adjudicate those comments before it moved forward with this particular case. They also told the FAA and us that should the FAA take any enforcement action based upon the interpretive rule, then we could go ahead and petition the court to take the case off of abeyance and move forward with resolution. So in essence what it did is it put our case on abeyance until the FAA completed its review, which it's still doing, and it basically told the FAA don't take any enforcement action based upon those areas that are addressed in the petition. So that brings us to something that just recently came out in Forbes. I think you guys are probably all aware of that an article came out in Forbes that the FAA says that now that as of August 29th, when Part 107 was implemented, that the only way you could operate FPV legally was under Part 107, which meant that you had to go out and get a remote pilot's license, you had to operate within the provisions of 107, which would be no faster than 100 miles an hour, daylight only, no higher than 400 feet, only in Class G airspace, without permission. And again, it all goes back to their interpretive rule that says that you can't fly FPV under Section 336, the special rule, because Congress said you had to actually have your own eyes on the aircraft. We have met with the FAA, I mean literally last week I was on the 10th floor of FAA headquarters meeting with the FAA executives on this issue. I would actually tell you who I met with, but I promised, because of what he told me, I promised I wouldn't do that. But in any case, I would tell you, nobody's recording this, right?
Yes. We are recording.
Let me rephrase what I was going to say. When the FPV issue first came up, and we're talking back in 2014, when the FPV first came up, we made the argument, that the way that we operate with an observer, monitoring the airspace and providing the see and avoid guidelines, is no different than what the manned aviation world does when they do instrument training for pilots. If you're a full-scale pilot, you want to learn how to fly under IFR or instrument conditions, they actually put you under a hood so that you can't see out the aircraft whatsoever. The only thing you can see is the instrumentation on the panel. And the person next to you, the instructor pilot, or if you're already an IFR certified pilot, the second observing pilot is then given the responsibility of monitoring the outside airspace and seeing and avoiding for any other traffic. Absolute identical situation that we're talking about with FPV from a safety standpoint. So, and I will tell you, for those that are recording, that in principle the FAA agrees with that. And quite honestly, we thought we had put the FPV issue to bed on that. And our expectation is that when the FAA finally comes out with its final clarification or revision of the interpretive rule, that will reflect that type of understanding on how that could be done using an observer in a safe manner. That's not FAA's official position today because it hasn't completed its review of those public comments and hasn't officially revised or clarified the interpretive rule. But since January or June of 2014, we have continued, AMA has continued to allow FPV operations, specifically FPV goggle operations, to occur as long as you have that second observer, what we call a spotter, standing next to the pilot, monitoring the airspace, maintaining situational awareness, and helping the pilot in terms of scene avoiding other traffic. We also in that document add that that person has to have the ability to take over the controls of the aircraft if absolutely necessary to avoid a collision, which means you either have a buddy box or you literally take the transmitter and fly the aircraft out of the dangerous situation. So we have allowed operations, that's in our document 550, to continue for the last 2 years under the special rule for model aircraft, if you will. There's nothing in Part 107 or the new revisions to Part 101 that changes that. The article that came out in Forbes and the statement that FAA made was based on its original interpretation in 2014, which is currently under judicial review and is yet to be resolved and adjudicated until FAA finishes its final review of those public comments. So the bottom line is, and we have communicated this to FAA, that we are going to continue to allow FPV operations under document 550 until the court makes a ruling otherwise and or the FAA revises its interpretation one way or the other. We're on record with the FAA as having said that. We published our notice to our members, was it yesterday or day before yesterday? And that is currently our position. I will tell you that I could be wrong on this, but I don't think you're going to see any FAA inspectors on site this weekend writing violations for not flying without a remote pilot certificate. I will tell you that we've been doing this for 2 years, and I stood next to the FAA personnel in Sacramento when I CD'd the race in Sacramento last summer. And there was nothing that occurred there that they took exception with, and quite honestly, they actually went away feeling very comfortable that operation was operated in a very safe and effective manner. So that's not a clean answer to the issue, and it probably won't have a clean answer until FAA finally revises its interpretive rule or the court rules on this case. But that is where we stand today, and we as a hobby community are continuing to operate under Section 336 and AMA's safety program.
Rich.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks for all the work you do for FPV. There's not many people fighting like you do. I know that you've put your name in to be the next president here at AMA. And do you think that would help your cause in fighting for FPV if you were to become the president? We're just trying to figure out how do we make it to where you can keep fighting for FPV. Is it better if you're the president, or is it better if you stay in the role that you're in now?
Well,
I want you to keep fighting for FPV.
well, I fight for the hobby overall. AMA has founded since 1936 upon technology and scientific development of aeronautics and aerospace disciplines. We have always invited new adjuncts to the hobby, new disciplines. I can remember back, I started out flying control line. I didn't get into radio control in the 70s when I had enough money to actually pay for the equipment. And back in those days, we could never envision being able to fly an RC helicopter. The technology just wasn't there. And until we came up with things like gyros and accelerometers and computerized radios, it just wasn't a way of doing that. Now flying RC helicopters is a commonplace, and it's a big part of our sport. I see FPV and multirotors and what people are calling drones is just that, just another advancement in the technology, another adjunct to the hobby, and quite honestly, looking at the age in this room, probably the next generation of model aircraft flyers. So I'm always going to be fighting for FPV and the hobby in general. It's one of the best things. I've been doing it since I was 6 years old, and it's the best leisure activity I can ever recommend to somebody get involved with, whether you're 6 years old or 96 years old. Yeah, and let me just finish this question real quick. And in terms of being AMA president, I would certainly welcome your support, and whether or not I continue as the government affairs guy, which quite honestly, given where I'm at right now, I'm phasing out of that as a staff position, or I take it on as president, I will continue to fight for the hobby and FPV as far as this community goes.
Thanks, sir. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm one of the few that's been, I've been a member of AMA for 27 years now.
Thanks.
And I'm one of the few that knows the history of what they've done for us. And I don't think anybody realizes that we wouldn't even have a hobby right now if it weren't for these guys. They took over all the frequency management and fought for us back in the 70s, late 70s, early
80s,
And
yeah.
we would not even be anywhere close where we are today, being able to use our video control equipment if it weren't for AMA. So
Appreciate that. And we did. That was an easier but bigger fight in the 80s to get the 50 channels that we have now for the analog portion of the hobby, which is kind of old school now with 2.4 and 5.8, but that's where we were back in the 80s.
it's starting to come back a little bit with the long range stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
As a community, is there anything that we can do to aid the FAA in their decision, educating them on how things are operated, or to make,
Well,
make things easier?
You know, I would actually go with what Chris said. The best thing that you can do is continue to fly safely and responsibly. The last thing we need is somebody getting hurt. When you look at the risks involved here, it's a relatively low-risk activity anyhow. I mean, I would almost argue that model aircraft in general pose a very minimal risk without any safety guidance, and if you add safety, common sense safety to it, it becomes extremely safe.
Yeah, but outside of this room, everybody thinks drones are going to just destroy the world.
Well, sure, but I think what you guys are doing in your communities in terms of inviting them out, like we'll do this weekend, and showing them that there's some exciting, entertaining aspect to this, without crossing that line and kind of couching it as an extreme sport. I think that hurts you if you really try and move it into that extreme sports arena. But as a fun, wholesome family activity, I think it benefits the community a lot. And one more thing I would say on safety is, you know, the biggie is we don't want to hurt a spectator or a bystander. That's number one. That's where your first risk mitigation attention needs to be, is make sure those people are safe. Second to that is the people that are volunteering their time and effort, their holiday weekend to work for you. Your workers need to be kept safe. Then the broader issue, and this community really doesn't even impact it whatsoever because of the altitude you're flying at, but certainly the airspace. You want to be respectful of the airspace you're in and understand that you're sharing that airspace, and to make sure that you are not interfering with manned aircraft that are flying around with people's lives at risk. Then there's your fellow participants. You want to make sure that you're not endangering the guy next to you that's flying as well. And then lastly, yourself. I mean, to put this in perspective, there's only been 6 fatal accidents in the history of model aviation in the United States that we're aware of. Of those 6, 4 of those 6 were people that killed themselves, or in one case it was a fellow modeler that killed themselves with their own aircraft. There's only been one person that you would really call a bystander that's ever been killed by a model aircraft.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So there's been no FPV accidents whatsoever that you guys know of that's been reported to you?
As far as injury accidents, right. I mean, there's some I know of some FPV aircraft that went in the parking lot and damaged a vehicle. And no, it wasn't on this property, but it was at an FPV race. I mean, one of our safety tenets is that everybody should maintain appropriate levels of financial responsibility, and that is accomplished as AMA members, because every one of you as an AMA member is provide $2.5 million worth of liability coverage for any injury or property damage that might incur because of an unfortunate mishap. And now I do need to caveat that is for your recreational activity, not a business use of the equipment. Yeah.
I want to go back to where they were saying that people think just drones are going to destroy the world and the community stuff. I've seen the transformation of several very anti-drone, anti-multirotor people that completely transferred from that stance to absolutely being at the races, supporting their 15-year-old kids because they love the fact that their kids aren't watching TV. They love the fact that they're learning technology. And so I think it's education that really needs to be done.
And I think you're right, and that's another encouraging part, is to see the number of youth that are getting into this sport. And this is actually a live video game, although you could argue that they're still on screens in their goggles. But
no reset button. No.
Yeah, but there's no reset button. And we've seen a huge surge. You know, as AMA has a youth program that anyone under the age of 19 gets a free membership in AMA. We have a program called UAS for STEM, which creates intercurricular competitions between schools and youth that put together teams of not racing necessarily, but UAS, aircraft and technologies. So we're really seeing a real insurgence in the youth interest, and this is sort of the combination, a perfect storm that combines aeronautics, computer sciences and robotics all into the same arena, and kids that are interested in any one of those three gets gratified by coming into it.
Outdoors.
Yeah, now they're outdoors. They're working with their other kids. The family's involved. I've got a great picture of an event out in DC.
Does not win a trophy.
That's right. But there's a great picture in DC. It was a whole family there. The kid, part of this program was that he builds a drone, a quadcopter, and the entire family, dad, mom, sister, and a brother, and the kid himself were sitting in a circle around this drone troubleshooting a problem he had with his drone on his maiden flight. It was just a perfect picture.
You know how this gentleman over here mentioned, has there been any reported incidences using FPV, you know, during the control of an RC aircraft? You know, I had a debate at one of the AUVSI meetings last year with former Director Williams, I guess it's, who was in charge of UAS integration into the airspace. You know, the big deal with FAA was, well, you know what, we don't have any data or results from having a drone hit an aircraft, right? You know, we don't have the millions of dollars in budget to shoot one in the engine, right? You know, like they've got frozen birds to do. But my point to him was, you know, what you classify as a drone, quote unquote, is something we've been flying for decades. You know what I mean? Hundreds and thousands of, if not millions of incidences a year that, you know, the lack of data is a data point because there is nothing to worry about. That's the problem. Yeah, they're not focusing on the fact that the reason they don't have any data because of an organization like yours, you know, that takes it under its own community-driven rules to, you know, educate and train and get people doing the right thing. You know, it's only of recent we've demonized RC through the drone word, right? You know what I mean? So the lack of data is a data point.
It is, but
FPV itself.
They don't accept it.
I know, but that's what's so silly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. You know
but it does.
They almost want an incident to occur to put it on record to show that they've got one, right? You know what I mean? It's just stupid. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
we all need to start reporting non-incidents. Successful FPV flight.
We did some studies in 2008 as part of the original ARC. It's a non-scientific study, and we did it through survey data. But we were able to basically calculate the number of RC flight hours that occur in a year, and we did it over the 14-year period that has our worst case of incidents, and that was then the 5 fatalities that we were aware of. But we did it over that period of time so that it would capture those 5 fatalities, and then calculated out the number of deaths per 100,000 flight hours, which is the benchmark FAA uses to assess safety levels, and it goes off the scale compared to any other aviation activity.
Well,
it's completely off the scale.
You know, if you're interested in safety, you know what I mean? Let's look at the safety incidences in RC in general, just in the last 10 years. Forget about the 50 years, you know what I mean, or whatever, you know, the last couple decades. just or even the last 4 years. You know what I mean? I mean, if you compare it to the FAA's got a horrible record of safety, you know, as far as logged incidences in comparison to drones or RC in general. You know what I mean?
As I said, there's only one fatality that we're aware of that involved a bystander. The other 5 all involved somebody that was participating in the hobby, and unfortunately, the majority of those were people that killed themselves with their own aircraft. Yeah.
I think it's for the merchant. Two things, to answer you, what we can do outside is, always we can comment, whenever we ask for, support, what we want. And then every time, we get more people into the hobby, before we train them how to fly or, how to build your drone, we can always tell them, this to do whenever, you're flying in the park. If you see people just, land, whatnot. And the second thing, what you said about, flying IFR, and you are flying with the instructor, the pilot in command. Let's say you're landing in bad weather, nobody is, there's a pilot and a co-pilot. When it's a bad weather, nobody can see anything. They're totally flying on instruments. So, that point even, takes out, you have to have a spotter, because, both those pilots with, hundreds of people behind them, their lives on their hand, they're landing in aircraft in bad weather, totally looking at the instrument.
Well, and honestly, if you contrast it, right? I mean, when you're flying line of sight, left is not always left, right is not always right. Orientation is a problem when you're flying line of sight, period. So if you're in control, if you're an FPV, left is always left, right is always right. You know what I mean? Period. I mean, cognitively speaking, it's a safer choice. You know, perspective-wise, it's just like being in the pilot's seat. It'd be like saying, you know what, we're no longer going to allow pilots to fly in the cockpit because they can't see their own plane flying. You know what I mean? So it doesn't make sense, is what I'm trying to get at.
We'll do one more.
Okay.
And then we have Ask the Panel at the end.
Sure. I was just, some of the guys back there were talking about how we can forward some of the safety issues. My question would be, here the AMA is having done so much in the community for so long with safety. A lot of the new pilots out there don't probably even know of the AMA and don't even know that there are fields to go to. I was just kind of wondering, everybody here, most people here must have a website, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. How many people have the AMA logo on their website?
We just got our charter, so we put it up there.
I mean, literally, is that half of us?
Yeah.
Well, I've got a big blog that says, hey, this is why you should join the AMA.
I mean,
This is
yeah,
why
I
you
do.
should
I think
register with the FAA.
I think this is probably one of the
Yeah.
biggest points we can make is that, to
spent
support the AMA in general as a whole community
Because if we don't,
on our
it's gonna be-
website,
I spend
social
so much
media.
time explaining to people about the AMA because 90% of them just see it as somebody who wants their money.
Yeah.
They're like, I'm not paying them.
Yeah.
I don't need them. I'm not paying them.
I think it can be
and I go,
even
well, do a little
supported better.
research and see what they do for you for that.
Yeah, what's the ROI?
The insurance alone is worth it. I mean, come on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Magazines
And that's
alone.
theft insurance too. If your pocket's broken.
Listen, I know we got to move on. I'll stay through the rest of the day, and I know we got a Q&A at the end, and I'll be glad to answer any more questions then.
Thank you.